Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the country you have lived in your entire life no longer exists. The street outside your home looks the same. The shops are still open. The market is still full of people. But something has changed. Overnight, borders have been drawn across the land. Places that once belonged to the same country are suddenly separated. Neighbors who lived side by side for generations now find themselves on opposite sides of a new nation. Families must make a decision that will change their lives forever. Stay and risk becoming strangers in the place you call home, or leave everything behind and begin again somewhere else. In 1947, this became the reality for millions of people across the Indian subcontinent. When British India was divided into two new countries, India and Pakistan, it triggered one of the largest migrations in human history. More than 14 million people were forced to move across newly created borders. Entire communities packed their belongings and began long journeys into uncertainty. And in the chaos that followed, up to 1 million people lost their lives. This moment is known as the Partition of India. But the events of 1947 did not appear suddenly. The story of partition had been building for decades. To understand the partition, we first have to understand the world that existed before it. For nearly 200 years, much of the Indian subcontinent was ruled by the British Empire. By the early 20th century, British India was one of the largest and most important colonies in the world. It stretched across enormous territories filled with many cultures, languages, and religions. Among the largest communities were Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. In towns and villages across the subcontinent, people of different faiths often lived side by side. They traded in the same markets, worked in the same fields, attended each other's celebrations. For many ordinary people, daily life was shared across religious lines. But under British colonial rule, political tensions slowly began to grow. British administrators governed a vast population with complex identities, and over time, religious communities increasingly became part of political representation. Some historians argue that the British colonial strategy sometimes encouraged divisions between communities. Political systems were created where representation was organized along religious lines. Separate electorates were introduced. Different communities were treated as distinct political groups. These policies did not immediately create conflict, but they gradually changed how politics worked in the region. Religion began to play a larger role in political identity. By the early 1900s, many Indians were demanding freedom from British rule. One of the leading political organizations in this movement was the Indian National Congress. Congress leaders argued that India should become an independent nation. Among the most famous leaders of this movement was Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi believed that political change could be achieved through non-violent resistance. He organized mass protests, boycotts of British goods, and campaigns of civil disobedience. Millions of Indians participated. Across cities and villages, people demanded the same thing: freedom. At the same time, another political organization was growing in influence. The All India Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, represented many Muslim political interests. Jinnah initially supported cooperation between communities, but as political tensions grew, concerns among Muslim leaders increased. Many feared that in an independent India, Muslims, who were a minority compared to Hindus, might lose political power. These fears led to a new political idea: the idea that Muslims in the subcontinent might need their own independent country. This proposal became known as the Demand for Pakistan. World War II changed everything. The war weakened the British Empire. Britain was exhausted economically and politically. Maintaining control over India was becoming increasingly difficult. By the mid-1940s, it had become clear that British India would soon end. But independence raised a difficult question. What would replace British India? Some leaders wanted a united, independent country where people of all religions could live together. Others believed that separate nations were necessary to protect different communities. Negotiations continued for years, but tensions were rising. Communal riots began breaking out in several cities. Political compromise became harder to achieve. Eventually, the British government made a decision. India would be divided. In 1947, Britain announced that the subcontinent would be partitioned into two new countries: India, which would be a largely Hindu-majority nation, and Pakistan, envisioned as a Muslim homeland. But there was a problem. How do you divide a land of hundreds of millions of people who have lived together for centuries? A British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe was given the task of drawing the borders. Radcliffe had never visited India before, yet he was given only 5 weeks to divide one of the most complex regions in the world. Using maps, census records, and political negotiations, he began drawing lines across provinces. These lines would become known as the Radcliffe Line. But the borders cut directly through regions where communities were deeply mixed. Villages were divided, cities were split. Railways, farms, and neighborhoods suddenly found themselves in different countries. When the borders were finally announced in August 1947, millions of people realized something shocking. They were now living in the wrong country. What followed was one of the largest migrations in human history. Muslims living in regions that became India began traveling towards Pakistan. Hindus and Sikhs living in areas that became Pakistan began traveling towards India. Entire families packed whatever they could carry. They left behind homes that had belonged to their families for generations, businesses, farms, memories. Many traveled by train. Others walked long distances across hot plains and dusty roads. Huge caravans of refugees stretched for miles. People carried children. Elderly relatives struggled to keep up. Some migrants traveled for weeks. No one knew what awaited them at the end of their journey. And as millions of people moved across the new borders, violence began to spread. Communal tensions that had been building for years suddenly erupted. Riots broke out across several regions. Armed groups attacked refugee caravans. Entire villages were burned. In some cases, trains filled with migrants arrived at their destination carrying only the dead. Cities like Lahore, Amritsar, and Delhi became scenes of chaos and fear. Neighbors who had once lived peacefully together now saw each other as enemies. Fear spread quickly. Rumors spread even faster. The violence escalated across the provinces of Punjab and Bengal, where the new borders cut most sharply. Historians estimate that up to 1 million people may have died during the violence. Millions more were injured, displaced, or separated from their families. For many survivors, the memories of those months would last a lifetime. And yet, even in the middle of tragedy, there were stories of courage. Some families risked their lives to protect neighbors of another religion. People hid strangers in their homes. Others guided refugees through dangerous routes to help them reach safety. There were countless small acts of compassion that rarely appear in history books. Moments where ordinary people chose humanity instead of hatred. These acts remind us that even during the darkest moments, kindness can still survive. By the end of 1947, the emigration had begun to slow. India and Pakistan had become two independent nations. But the consequences of partition were enormous. Cities had to absorb millions of refugees. Entire communities had to rebuild their lives from nothing. Families who once lived in the same neighborhood were now separated by international borders. The emotional scars of partition would shape the politics and relationships of South Asia for generations. Even today,
the memories of that time remain deeply personal for many families. The Partition of India remains one of the most dramatic and painful moments in modern history. It reminds us how political decisions can reshape the lives of millions of people almost overnight. It shows us how quickly fear and division can lead to violence. But it also reminds us of the resilience of ordinary people. Families who rebuilt their lives, communities that found ways to move forward, and stories that continue to be remembered across generations. Because understanding history is not only about remembering tragedy, it is about learning from it, so that the divisions of the past do not become the conflicts of the future.
If this video helped you understand the history of the Partition of India more clearly, take a moment to support the channel. You can help more people discover and learn from these important historical stories by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others who might find it meaningful. And if you have thoughts or reflections about this moment in history, leave a comment below. Your voice helps keep these conversations alive. Thank you for watching.